Chapter 4, Potato Breeding. The cultivated potato of today has undergone a remarkable change since its first introduction into Europe by the Spaniards. Some of this change has been brought about by better cultivation, but most of it is due to breeding. The tubers of the wild S. tuberosum were small and attracted little attention. Heriot, in his report on Virginia, describes the plant with roots as large as a walnut and others much larger. They grow in damp soil, many hanging together as if tied on ropes. The potato as we know it has been developed by means of conscious and unconscious selection and by hybridization with other species. The modern potato has not only been much changed by breeding, but it is now grown in widely different surroundings which produce various changes in the tubers. There are three foundations on which the increased productivity of crops rests: the enrichment of the land, its tillage and care, and the production of better varieties and strains. The first two are concerned with the environment of the crop, such as cultivation, fertilization, freedom from insects, disease, and so forth, and the last with its heredity. We have long given attention to environment. Now we are studying heredity with new enthusiasm and purpose. One of the signs of the times is the attention that is being given to the practical breeding of crops. We have learned that good seed is a necessary accompaniment to high fertility and good care, and also the desirability of different varieties adapted to varying needs of soil, climate, and man. These wild forms have been taken, in most cases, from their original habitats and placed under conditions of soil, temperature, and moisture to which they are not accustomed. Here, selection must not only modify the plants better to meet the wants of man, but they must become adapted to their new environment. Most plants are very flexible and finally become adapted to a variety of conditions. This is evidenced by the very large number of varieties of which most of our cultivated plants consist. Results of careful and systematic breeding are accumulating rapidly with very many kinds of plants. The results of all this work will probably enable us, eventually, to formulate somewhat definite statements as to how to proceed to secure desired results. Considerable evidence is already at hand, but on the whole, the methods of breeding are still somewhat empirical. All of our cultivated plants have come from wild forms. Man has seen in them possibilities of usefulness, and he has chosen year after year the ones which better serve his purpose. This constant selection has in the course of time produced profound changes in our plants. Ideals for the potato crop. Plant breeding is worthy of the name only as it sets definite ideals and is able to attain them. Merely to produce new varieties is of no merit. We must give up the production of mere novelties unless the new variety possesses some property which makes a real contribution to our present varieties. Plate 3. A plate of smooth potatoes with few and shallow eyes, the breeder's ideal. That depends on what you're using it for. It is unfair and dishonest consciously to rename old varieties under the pretense of producing something new. Our list of varieties contains many synonyms, and these should not be consciously increased. In general, the improvement of our present standard varieties offers greater opportunities for the increased efficiency of the new generation of plants than the production of entirely new varieties. Ideals for the perfect potato will change in the different localities. Certain attributes, however, are universally desired. These are as follows: 1. High yield. 2. Good quality. 3. Disease-resisting capabilities. 4. Good keeping qualities. 5. Good color of flesh and skin. 6. Skin of desirable texture. 7. Tubers of good shape. 8. Shallow eyes, relatively few in number. 9. Maturing in season common to the variety. 10. Upright, vigorous plants. 11. Heavy leaf cuticle. 12. No tendency to make second growth. 13. Trueness to type of variety grown. High yield is essential if the grower expects to continue raising potatoes for market. In aiming to secure high yield, however, we should remember that there are many other factors which determine the marketability and price of the product. Tubers of inferior quality, size, and the like are not of great value even in large quantities. From the consumer's point of view, quality is highly important. The grower would do well to keep his potatoes up to standard in this respect. Potatoes intended for human consumption should have a mealy flesh when boiled or baked. Up to a certain limit, the quality improves with an increase in starch content. Potatoes to be used for the production of alcohol need be of no particular quality from the culinary standpoint. There are no disease-proof varieties, but some are more resistant than others. Resistance is more important in the East than in the Mississippi Valley. It is necessary to store potatoes for a long period to supply the demands between crops. If the keeping qualities of a strain are poor, there are fewer potatoes which can be sold in the spring. In a sense, then, poor keeping quality is a factor which decreases yield. The ideal color of skin and flesh will depend largely upon market preferences. In general, a yellow skin and white flesh are desired. In the South, the red or pink skin varieties are in favor. Because of the red color of some weak varieties, growers are likely to be skeptical of all colored varieties. The skin may be thick, medium, or thin. When grown in sandy soil, the skin is usually smoother than when grown in heavy loams. A netted and slightly rough skin is preferred, many believing that it indicates proper maturity and good quality. Flat round or flat oval tubers are better than the spherical, as the cortical and outer medullary layers containing the starch and are relatively larger. Also, a flat tuber bakes better because the center is not too far from the outside. Plate 4. Illustration of good-shaped potato for table use. Variety, Green Mountain. Deep eyes cause waste in peeling. They hold moisture, thereby causing decay and storage. The tuber should have enough eyes to make good seed, but not so many as to make peeling difficult. Early varieties may mature in 70 to 90 days after planting. Second earlier in 90 to 130 days, and late varieties may continue to grow for 200 days. It is important to choose a variety adapted to the locality. The haulm and leaf are considered more important than formerly. Large haulms require wider spacing of plants and greater expense for spraying. Short haulmed upright, heavy-leafed tops are not as susceptible to disease as the prostrate types. The upright types are more likely to suffer during very dry spells. However, because the tops do not prevent the evaporation of moisture from the soil, as do those of the more prone types, care should be exercised to select a variety which is well suited to local conditions and which will grow vigorously. Differences in vigor will be noted in different strains of the same variety. Leaves with thick cuticles are not as easily penetrated by disease spores. When a period of drought is followed by a wet spell, second growth is likely to begin. The dry weather checks growth and the tubers begin to mature. Subsequent wet weather restarts growth. Such abnormalities should be discarded in selecting seed. It is essential that the seed be as represented. None but experts can tell the different varieties apart, so seed should be obtained from a reliable source. The half-tone illustrations in plates 3 to 7 show some of the desirable potato forms and also results in breeding. Use of scorecard. A scorecard presents in a logically arranged tabular form the different factors which make up an ideal potato. These factors are given relative importance or weight by means of percentage numbers, the sum of which is 100. One should make frequent use of a scorecard to familiarize himself with all details and to compare his product with the theoretical ideal product which it describes. The scorecard should be studied so as to establish the ideal of the desired variety firmly in mind before any attempt is made at improvement. When breeding a crop, special attention should be paid to the details. The proper combination of the little and usually overlooked points makes the perfect crop. It is important, further, to bear in mind the fact that a variety which is merely as good as any other in cultivation is not worth introducing. It should be better in some particular than any other in existence. The operator must know the points of his plant, as an expert stock breeder knows the points of an animal, and he must possess the rare judgment to determine which characters are most likely to reappear in the offspring. Inasmuch as a person can be an expert in only a few plants, it follows that he cannot expect satisfactory results in breeding any species which may chance to come before him. Persistent and uniform effort, continued over a series of years, is generally demanded for the production of really valuable varieties. Thus, it often happens that one man excels all competitors in breeding a particular class of plants. If the operator, himself an expert judge of the plant with which he deals, chooses his seeds with care and discrimination, and then proposes, if need be, to follow up his work generation after generation by means of selection, the work becomes plant breeding of the highest type. Plate 5. Typical early and late potatoes. Top. Irish cobbler, early. Bottom. Rural New Yorker, late. First of all, therefore, the operator must know what he is likely to secure, and what will probably be worth securing. Most persons, however, begin at the other end of the problem. They get what they can and then let the public judge whether the effort has been worth the while. The following scorecard has been adopted by the New York State Potato Association. Potato Scorecard. Conformity to varietal type is 100 points, and conformity to market demand is 100 points. So for uniformity, 20 for varietal and 20 for market. Blemishes and disease, 15 for varietal and 20 for market demand. Shape, 15 for varietal type, conformity to varietal type for the shape, and 15 for conformity to market demand for the shape. Size, 10% for varietal type, 15% for market demand. Quality of flesh, 10% for varietal type, 10% for market demand. Depth and frequency of eyes, 15% for varietal type and 10% for market demand. Color and texture of skin, 15% for varietal type and 10% for market demand, so that each of the percents add up to 100. This scorecard is arranged with the idea of emphasizing the more important characteristics to be considered in selecting potatoes both true to varietal type and in accordance with market demands. These two sets of qualifications are in many cases quite distinct. It is, therefore, true that the variety which fulfills both of these requirements is the one that scores highest and of which production should be encouraged. Uniformity. Exhibit should be uniform in all physical characteristics. Blemishes and disease. Should be no evidence of blight, rot, grubs, rhizoctonia, sunburn, or injury from rough handling. Shape. Should be typical of the variety. Market demands a moderately oval flat or round flat shape. Size. Should be typical of the variety. Market demands a medium-sized potato. Quality of flesh. Should be true of the variety. Market requires a fine-textured flesh of light color, free from excess moisture and from hollow or dark spots. Depth and frequency of eyes. Should be typical of the variety. Market demands few and shallow eyes. Color and texture of skin. Should be typical of the variety. Market demands a thin, smooth skin. White skin varieties are preferable in most markets. Possibilities of improving the potato. Even though the potato has been in cultivation for centuries, further improvement is by no means impossible. It responds very quickly to breeding. Most varieties are very impure and contain various types. The first task of the breeder is to become thoroughly acquainted with his plants so as to discard the poor plants and save the good ones for future planting. If this is done for a few years, the average yield of the crop and its uniformity will be greatly benefited. The hill selection of potatoes is not generally practiced, and as a consequence, the varieties soon deteriorate and run out. This deterioration could be easily prevented by paying careful attention to planting seed from the best hills. It must not be forgotten that potatoes are now grown in regions where the climate is not entirely congenial to them. This constant action of a somewhat unfavorable climate will also cause them to degenerate if not counteracted by seed selection. Careful experiments have been conducted with potatoes in which the offspring of different tubers are planted and recorded separately. Many of these progenies seem to degenerate completely, indicating that some degenerative factor, still unknown, is constantly at work. This deterioration is partially due to disease, without doubt, but some of it is also of a physiological nature. The yields of any field or the average yields of any locality or of an entire state are far below what they should be. This is due to two causes. The conditions surrounding the crop have not been the best, perhaps insufficient food supply or water or poor soil. And secondly, the absence of seed selection has produced a poor stand of plants, many of which probably give low yields. By proper attention to fertilization, spraying, and seed selection, the yield may often be doubled or trebled. Perhaps we can never expect the high yields to the acre obtained in Europe because of our hot, dry climate. See Chapter 1. If seed selection becomes generally practiced, with its accompanying increase in yields, vast consequences may be looked for. If all of the hills on an acre of potatoes planted in the ordinary manner weigh 1/2 a pound, there will be a yield of 78 bushels to the acre. A half-pound hill, however, is very small. One ordinary sized tuber will weigh more than that. If, by means of breeding, the average yield to a hill is increased to 1, 2, or 3 pounds, which is not at all impossible, the yields to the acre will be increased to 156, 312, and 468 bushels respectively. If this reasoning were applied to all of the potato fields in the United States, the results would be almost unbelievable. Burbank has made the conservative estimate that if one tuber were added to each hill, the total resulting increase in the United States would be 21 million bushels yearly. The following table gives the yields to the acre from hills of certain weights. It is assumed that the hills were 18 inches apart in the rows, and the latter were 3 feet apart. This rate of planting gives 9,372 hills on an acre. Table 9. So the 3 columns are yield to the hill in pounds, perfect stand bushels to the acre, and 90% stand bushels to the acre. So half a pound hill, 78.1 perfect stand bushels, 70.29 90% stand. 1 pound would give 156.2 bushels per acre and 140.58 bushels to the acre, 90% stand. I'll skip some of these. 2 pounds yield to the hill will give 312.4 bushels to the acre and 281.16 bushels to the acre with a 90% stand. If you have 3 pounds to the hill, you'll get 468.6 bushels to the acre, and if there's with a perfect stand, and a 90% stand on a 3 pound yield to the hill is 421.74 bushels to the acre. And finally, if you get 4 pounds to the hill, on a perfect stand you get 624.8 bushels to the acre, and in a 90% stand you get 562.32 bushels to the acre. Methods of improvement. Plants are improved in 3 ways. First, by simple selection, that is, breeding from the best, the object being to improve the present varieties rather than the production of new ones. Second, to conduct extensive plantings for the purpose of discovering some unusually good individuals or mutants, which may become the foundation of improved varieties and which subsequently require little else of the grower than their multiplication. And third, by crossing plants to combine the best qualities of 2 or more parents in a new and improved variety. Plate 6, breeding. Each group of 4 plates represents the progeny of a tuber, and each plate is the produce of a single hill. Improvement of the potato by selection. The principal method of improving the potato is by bud selection. Potato hills are very variable, and improvement is made by planting tubers from the best hills. Many of these apparent improvements may be due to some advantage in growth, such as increased fertility, more light or moisture, and so forth. Of course, this increase is only transitory, and not being inherited produces no permanent advancement. The potato, however, presents variations which are inherited. These are of 2 kinds: smaller differences whose inheritance produces a gradual change, and large differences or so-called bud sports, or bud mutants, which immediately become the starting point of new varieties. Potatoes differ from most farm crops in their manner of reproduction. They are propagated vegetatively without the intervention of a sexual process like corn or wheat. Each hill of potatoes comes from one tuber or a part of a tuber which was the product of one bud of the mother plant. Hence, the entire hill becomes a unit, and hill selection is, in reality, bud selection. Single tubers cannot be said to be units from the breeder's standpoint. Therefore, it is of supreme importance to take into account the yield of an entire hill and not the presence in it of 2 or 3 large tubers, resulting in low total yield for the hill. So far as man is concerned, the origin of the initial variation is largely chance. But this start or variation once given, he has the power, in most cases, to perpetuate it and to modify its characters. There are 2 very different factors or problems in the origination of potato varieties by selection: the product of the first departure or variation and the subsequent breeding of it. It is apparent that the very first effort on the part of the potato breeder must be to secure individual differences. If the plants which he grows are very much alike, there will be very little hope of obtaining new varieties. He should, if possible, cause his plants to vary. This initial variation may usually be induced by changing the conditions in which the plant has habitually grown, as a change of seed, change of soil, tillage, varying the food supply, crossing, and the like. As a matter of fact, however, nearly all plants which have been long cultivated, like the potato, are already sufficiently variable to afford a starting point for breeding. The grower should have a vivid mental picture of the variety which he desires to obtain. Then he should choose those hills which most nearly meet that ideal. Experimental breeding has demonstrated that the different varieties of farm and garden plants, as we ordinarily know them, are not entirely homogeneous and uniform, but are made up of smaller groups now known as pure lines. It is ordinarily understood that a pure line is the progeny of a self-fertilized individual. That is, one in which all effects of crossing have been eliminated by constant self-fertilization. In potatoes, which are ordinarily propagated asexually, a pure tuber line would be the progeny of a single tuber. Experiments seem to demonstrate that the group of individuals known as a pure line vary much less than the variety as a whole, and the selection of the best individuals within a pure line has little, if any, effect in raising the average of the line. This has not been proved by any means, but the indications are that only a very slight advance is made by continued selection after a pure line has been reached, unless an exceptionally good individual should arise, whose progeny would constitute a new and better line. It will now be seen that the first work in improving potatoes by selection is to determine the best tuber lines and plant them for seed. This necessitates carrying out a system of breeding whereby individual tubers must be planted separately and properly labeled, and their progeny kept separate for a few years to determine whether or not the desirable plants transmit their qualities to future generations. See Plate 6. This is known as pedigree breeding. Myers gives the following table to show variation in the yielding capacity of different tubers. Each unit is the product of a different parental tuber. So, Table 10, unit number, as compared to yield in bushels to the acre. So, unit number 1, 110 bushels to the acre. Unit number 2, 220 bushels to the acre. Unit 3, 220 bushels to the acre. I'm not going to read all those. You can see them here. If the first work of breeding consists of separating out pure lines, and if there is very slow progress within these lines, it is obvious that the choice of individuals for planting the first few years is all important. As large fields as possible should be grown to give opportunity for all of the best plants to appear. So, Figure 8, potato yields. Diagram showing variation in yield of individual rows of potatoes grown on special seed plots in 1909. That's Carmen number 1 by R.H. Crosby, Markham, O.N.T. I guess that's Ontario. So the top graph is total number tubers to the row. That's from 1 up to 25. And on the left is from 0 up to 80. The next bar graph, line graph, is number marketable tubers to the row. And the third line graph is the number of diseased tubers to the row. Until recently, the method of selection has been to choose from the potato bins in the spring the requisite amount of seed, using tubers having the desired size and shape, but without knowledge of whether they came from high-yielding strains or not. This method of choosing seed from year to year, using merely the best tubers, without a knowledge of their ancestry or obtaining a test of their producing power, is known as mass selection. This method will inevitably lead to improvement because the very poor hills will not produce good tubers and hence will be eliminated. But the improvement is a very slow one. Let's see, Plate 7, tubers with histories. Upper, influence of unfavorable growing season, showing the second growth tubers on the right compared with normal, uniform tubers on the left. Lower, breeding the immunity and susceptibility of two tuber progenies. Figure 9 is a continuation of Figure 8. In employing this method of mass selection, growers were working blindly without knowing how or when or even whether they were going to reach a stability of type. On the other hand, the method of pedigreed culture or individual selection eliminated the fear of failure because of the appearance of the hitherto unsurmountable variations. Plants which have any desired characteristics in common may differ widely in their ability to transmit these characters. It is generally impossible for the cultivator to determine, from the appearance of any given progeny, the most invariable and the most like its parent. But it may be said those individuals which grow up in the most usual or normal environments are most likely to perpetuate themselves. A very unusual condition, as of soil, moisture, or exposure, is not easily imitated when providing for the succeeding generation, and a return to normal conditions of environment may be expected to be followed by a more or less complete return to normal attributes on the part of the plant. If the same variation, therefore, were to occur in plants growing under widely different conditions, the operator who wishes to preserve the new form should take particular care to select his tubers from those individuals which seem to have been least influenced by the immediate conditions in which they were grown. The method of individual selection or pedigree breeding is now universally accepted by the best breeders. In potato breeding, it is known as the tuber unit method. That is, the progenies of individual tubers are tested for a number of years to determine the best pure lines which are constant from year to year. One of the first and best methods of breeding potatoes by the tuber unit or pedigree plan has been devised by H.J. Weber. This method is so satisfactory when properly carried out that it is given here in detail. Selection of foundation stock of potatoes. Probably no crop generally grown is more influenced by environment than the potato. The experience of growers indicates that a variety found to be the best suited to local conditions on one farm may not prove to be the variety best suited to the conditions existing on an adjoining farm. It thus becomes desirable for any farmer who is growing potatoes extensively to test varieties sufficiently to determine which is the variety best suited to the local conditions concerned. This ordinarily does not require an extensive test, as the experience of growers in a region has usually shown the general superiority of a comparatively few varieties, and a test can thus be limited to these varieties which in general are known to be the best. The writer would not urge this test of varieties if it were not very important to begin any breeding work with the best variety available. Breeding work requires so much attention that it does not pay to start with an inferior variety. The first effort of any one contemplating breeding with potatoes is thus to determine the best foundation stock to use for the selection work. If the grower has had extensive experience in growing potatoes and has determined that a certain variety gives the best results under his conditions, he is in a position to start the selection without a further test of varieties. Growing potatoes for selection. The influence of the number of eyes and size of piece planted as seed has so much to do with the yield of the hill that fields planted in the ordinary way are very poorly adapted to begin the work of selection. It is of primary importance that the first selections be of the very highest type obtainable, as it is a common experience that the first selection is the most important. Too much attention cannot be given, therefore, to the first selection. The writer would thus urge the following method as one of the most satisfactory to be pursued. 1. Examine a large number of tubers of the variety selected as the foundation stock and decide on the most desirable shape and type of tuber. In general, a moderately large tuber, which is oblong or somewhat cylindrical in shape and oblong in cross-section, is considered most desirable. A spherical tuber, if sufficiently large to be desirable, is so thick that in cooking the outside is likely to become overdone before the interior is properly cooked. A tuber with shallow eyes, netted surface, and white color is also usually preferred. Probably the best sized potato for general use is one weighing 7 to 8 ounces. A potato of this size does not have to be cut when served, as a single tuber is about the right size to an individual. Again, this sized tuber is well fitted for cooking, and it is small enough so that the interior will cook nearly as quickly as the exterior. Probably the most desirable shape is when the tuber has a major axis or length of 3 1/2 inches to 4 inches, with a width of possibly 3 to 3 1/4 inches and a thickness of 2 to 2 1/4 inches. In a tuber of this shape, the center of the potato at any point is only about 1 inch from the exterior. 2. When the ideal character and size have been determined, examine a large number of tubers and pick out 1,000 or more having this size, shape, and general character. This is work that can be done in the late fall and winter when there is no rush of other farm work, and time should be taken to secure a considerable number of these tubers of the same character. These are to be used for planting the selection plot, and the number selected should correspond to the size of the plot which is desired to plant. 4 hills being planted with each tuber. There should certainly not be less than 1,000, and a much larger number is more desirable. The prospective breeder should remember that success in breeding work depends upon selecting the one individual that gives the very highest yield possible under the conditions, and the larger the number of individuals examined, the more likely is he to discover the one producing the maximum yield, which will give a valuable new strain. There is no loss in growing this selection plot aside from the greater amount of time required for the digging, so that one should grow a considerable number of plants. 3. The planting should be arranged in such a way as to secure a test of the productivity of each tuber. To do this, the following method may be recommended. Cut each tuber into 4 uniform-sized pieces, making each cut longitudinally so that each piece will contain an equal proportion of the basal end and the apical end of the tuber. Plant 4 hills with each tuber, 1 piece in the hill. These should be planted consecutively in each row, beginning at one end, so that starting at that end, the first 4 hills will be from one tuber, the second 4 from another, and so on throughout the length of the row. The object in planting this way is that 4 hills can be dug together and the total product weighed to obtain a measure of the productivity of the seed tuber planted. Probably the best way to plant these is to drop the selected tubers, 1 to each 4 hills, and then go over the row and cut each tuber and plant its quota of 4 hills. The hills in the row should be planted somewhat farther apart than in ordinary planting, probably 20 to 24 inches. If this is not done, a somewhat greater distance than ordinary should be left between each two 4-hill tuber units. The writer would advise that one hill be left unplanted between each two 4-hill units. It would doubtless be convenient and desirable to have the plants in rows both ways to facilitate digging. For this selection plot of potatoes, choose a field of moderately good fertility and as uniform throughout in soil as it is possible to obtain. 4. Manure and cultivate the plot of potatoes grown for selection just the same as you do your ordinary crop. How to make the selection of potatoes. Field examination. A careful examination of the selection field should be made as the vines begin to mature and while they are yet green. This examination should include observations on diseases and vigor of the tops. If there are any marked differences apparent between the different 4-hill units, those with the best appearing, most healthy tops should be marked by small stakes which can be stuck in the ground beside the hills. This field examination, while important and careful work, probably could be omitted without very great loss, as after all the yield is the primary character. Digging the selection field. The digging of the field grown for selection purposes requires considerable care, and here hard work is necessary. Dig each 4-hill unit grown from the same tuber separately, being careful to get all of the product and avoid cutting or injuring the tubers if possible. Carefully place the product of each 4-hill tuber unit together at one side of the row, and if it is a tuber unit marked with a stake in the field examination, keep the stake with the product of the unit. A good way to dig in order to avoid getting the hills of different tuber units mixed is to dig across the field in a direction at right angles to the direction the rows were planted. First dig the 4 hills of the first tuber planted in the first row, then the 4 from the first tuber in the second row, then the same in the third row, fourth row, etc., through the field. Next dig the 4 hills from the second tuber planted in the first row, then the 4 from the second tuber in the second row, etc. By this method of digging, especially if the hills are rowed both ways, there will be little danger of mixing the product of the 4-hill units. Making the selections. The problem after digging is to select 50 to 100 of the best tuber units, best that is, in yield, uniformity of product, color, shape, etc. After the potatoes are dug and the product of each tuber unit is laid out separately, the real work of selection begins. The following are the important steps in this process. 1. Go over the field and study the tuber units in a gross way until you have well in mind the variations in yield and the general uniformity of the tubers in the various tuber units. Remember that the total yield is not the only important character. What one wants is to discover those tuber units which have the largest yield of good merchantable potatoes of the best shape and appearance. Size up the field as a whole with reference to these characters. 2. Go over each row carefully and throw out all of those tuber units which can be clearly seen to be inferior. These may be thrown together and placed with the general crop of potatoes. For the interest of the grower, however, it would be well to weigh the product from some of the light-yielding tuber units and preserve the figures for the sake of showing the extent of variations occurring. By this first discarding process, the number of tuber units will probably have been reduced to 200 or 300. It is very probable that in some cases, one or more of the hills of a 4-hill tuber unit will not grow. In such cases, the tuber unit will have to be judged in proportion to the number of hills actually grown. 3. Now provide yourself with scales of some handy pattern like the ordinary counter scales used by grocers, with which the product of each tuber unit can be easily and quickly weighed. A satisfactory scale should weigh accurately to at least a ½ ounce. Weigh the product of the remaining tuber units, examine the tubers more carefully as to their character and uniformity of size in the tuber unit, and select about 50 of the best units. These 50 units should naturally be from those marked as having good healthy vines in the first examination before digging, unless all of the vines at that time were in fairly good condition. In making these final selections, if some hills in the tuber unit are missing, the comparative yield can be easily calculated. If one hill is missing, a comparative yield for 4 hills is obtained by increasing the weight from the 3 hills by 1/3. If 2 hills are missing, a comparative yield for 4 hills would be double that obtained from the 2 hills. If more than 2 hills are missing, discard the unit entirely. The product of the tuber units selected should then be placed in paper bags, the product of one tuber unit only being placed in a bag. A good bag for the purpose is the 12 or 16-pound manila paper bag used by grocers. The 12-pound paper bags of good quality should cost only about 40 cents per 100. Remember, this is over 100 years old. If the 12-pound paper bag is too small, use a 16-pound bag. In your notebook, record under the number of each tuber unit the number of large, medium-sized, and small tubers, and the total weight of the product. The bags containing the seed should then be placed in suitable storage where they will not be torn or the tubers mixed. The tubers from the best discarded tuber units should be retained to plant the general crop the next year. If at digging time the grower is crowded with work and wishes to save time, the 200 or 300 tuber units retained after the first gross selection, see paragraph 2 above, could be placed in paper bags, and the more careful examination and weighing of the product delayed until some convenient time during the winter when the final selection could be made. Selecting seed for the second year's planting. Sometime during the winter, or at any convenient period before planting time, carefully examine the product of each select tuber unit and pick out the 10 best tubers of each as judged by the ideal standard of a good tuber, which has been taken as the type of the selection. The 10 best of each retain in the numbered sacks for planting and discard the remaining tubers. Second year's planting. In the further handling of the selections made the first year, the planting the second year must be arranged in order to test the productive power of each of the 50 select tuber units. Plant each tuber unit in a row by itself by the same method used in planting the first year's crop. See page 64. That is, plant 4 hills with each tuber, cutting the tuber longitudinally into 4 equal-sized quarters, making each cut from base to apex of the tuber. As 10 select tubers were retained from each tuber unit, this will make 40 hills per row. And if 50 tuber units were selected, there will be 500 tubers to plant, which will make a total of 2,000 hills in the breeding plot. The land used for this breeding plot should be carefully chosen for uniformity, as variations in the land will modify the comparative yield and are likely to render the results untrustworthy. Number each row of 40 hills with the number given the tuber unit of the preceding year. It is desirable for comparison to plant about every 10th row with unselected seed of the same variety, cut and planted in the same way, but without reference to keeping each tuber separate. The production of these check rows will show whether progress is being made in the selection. Cultivate the breeding plot and treat it otherwise just as an ordinary crop is treated.